Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The shuttle rumbled as it descended through the turbulent atmosphere of Sisera, a dying planet whose cracking surface was a graveyard of forgotten promises. Captain Julia Morgan gripped the armrest tightly, watching the fractured landscape rise to meet them. The turbulence wasn't just atmospheric. The planet itself was tearing apart, each new fracture sending tremors that reverberated into the sky. His pale fingers hovered over a small data tablet, his eyes flickering with excitement as energy readings spiked again and again. "Do you feel that, Captain?" Monroe asked, his voice distant. "The energy here, it's like nothing I've ever seen. This isn't just geological collapse. Something far greater is happening beneath the surface." Julia didn't answer immediately. Her focus was on the landing, her military instincts bracing for the worst. But even she felt it, the oppressive weight in the air, like an invisible force pushing against her chest. It was unsettling, as if the planet itself was watching them. The shuttle hit the ground with a hard jolt, and Julia exhaled. Touchdown, and she called over the comms, unbuckling herself from the harness. "Let's get to work. We don't have much time." Her crew, all seasoned colonists and engineers, began disembarking. Lieutenant Kamara O'Neill was already barking orders to the rest of the team, organizing the setup of the temporary base. She was efficient, no nonsense, but Julia had noticed the tension in O'Neill's eyes ever since they entered Sisera's orbit. The lieutenant was skeptical of this mission from the start, and Julia couldn't blame her. So Shiro was an active disaster zone. Setting up a colony here seemed like a death wish. "Logan, house us the equipment," Julia called to the head engineer, Logan Sanders, who was overseeing the unloading of the drilling machinery. Logan wiped the sweat from his brow, his face shadowed by the planet's dim red sun. "Everything's intact, but I am not sure how long it will stay that way. The tectonic activity here is off the chart." Julia gave him a curt nod. "Just keep it operational for as long as possible." As she walked towards the growing encampment, the ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though it might crack open at any moment. But worse than the physical instability was the strange sensation drawing at the edges of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong here, beyond the crumbling surface, beyond the geological instability. It felt personal, like a shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting. "Captain, you should see this." Monroe's voice broke through her thought. She turned to find him standing by the crevasse, a massive rift that stretched across the landscape. The ground here had torn apart, revealing layers of rock and glowing crystals deep below. Monroe knelt beside a scanner, his expression alight with discovery. "The energy coming from this planet's core, it's not natural." Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "Look at these readings." Monroe held out his tablet, the screen flickering with data spikes. "This energy doesn't match anything we've ever recorded from other planets that Hansen controlled. There's some intelligence behind it." Julia narrowed her eyes, scanning the data. "Sure you think something's alive down there?" Monroe shook his head, standing slowly, turned on alive, but something is still active. "I believe this planet was tampered with by an ancient civilization. This energy isn't a byproduct of the planet's decay, and it's a decay." Julia's skin prickled, "And it's affecting us already, isn't it?" Monroe didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes confirmed her suspicion. The whispers she thought she heard earlier, the shadows moving at the edge of her vision, they weren't just paranoia, they were real, or at least they felt real. That night, Julia lay in her cot, unable to sleep. The tent walls were thin, and the planet's incessant groaning seeped through them. Every now and then, she'd hear a sharp crack as the ground shifted, or what sounded like footsteps just outside her tent. She knew it was impossible. Everyone was accounted for, resting in their designated area. But still, the feeling persisted, like someone or something was just outside watching. Her calm crackled to life. "Captain, it's O'Neill. We've got a problem." Julia jumped out of bed, adrenaline spiking. "What restaurant?" "It's Monroe." He sat and gone back to the crevasse alone. The crevasse loomed before her as she reached the location with O'Neill. The faint glow from the crystals below gave the scene an eerie light, casting long shadows that shifted with the wind. Monroe was standing dangerously close to the edge, staring down into the abyss. "Monroe," Julia shouted, running toward him. "What the hell are you doing?" Monroe didn't return. His gaze remained fixed on the depths below, his expression blank as though he wasn't truly present. "It's calling to us," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It wants us to understand." Julia grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the edge. "Get a grip. This planet is falling apart and you re-losing it." Monroe blinked as though waking from a dream. He looked at her, confusion clouding his face. I don't know what happened." "Whatever this energy is, it's messing with your head," Julia snapped, keeping her voice low but firm. "We can't afford to lose control out here." O'Neill, standing a few feet back, scanned the horizon. "We need to start considering an evacuation. This planet is unstable, and now it's affecting our minds. It's too dangerous." Julia wanted to argue to tell her that they hadn't finished the mission yet, but deep down she felt the same gnawing fear. Something was wrong with this planet, and it was only going to get worse. "We need more data before we make any decisions," Julia said. "We'll monitor the team closely. If the hallucinations get worse, we'll reevaluate." Monroe's voice trembled as he spoke again. "It's not just hallucinations, it's something far deeper. We're not alone here." The following days were tense. The colonists continued their work, drilling into the planet's surface and setting up the first colony structures, but the atmosphere was thick with paranoia. Reports of strange occurrences spread like wildfire, phantom voices, shadowy figures moving at the edge of the camp, and equipment malfunctioning without explanation. Logan Sanders, the head engineer, was the first to crack. Julia found him in the mess hall one evening, pacing back and forth, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They re-watching us," Logan muttered, barely aware of her presence. "They right there in the shadows. I see them every time I close my eye." Julia gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Logan, listen to me. There's nothing there. It's just this planet messing with your head." Logan shook his head, violently pulling away from her. "No, you don't understand. They real. I saw them. They waiting for us to fall apart." That night, Logan disappeared. They searched the camp and surrounding area for hours, but there was no sign of him. It was as if the planet had swallowed him whole. Julia knew they couldn't afford to lose another colonist, not with morale already hanging by a thread. By now, the team had split into two clear factions. O'Neill had taken command of the group pushing for evacuation, convinced that the planet's influence was only going to get worse. Julia, however, wasn't ready to abandon the mission despite the growing fear, despite the hallucinations. She knew they had to push forward. But the cracks were showing every day. More colonists reported vivid hallucinations. Some saw loved ones they had lost. Others relived traumatic events that had shaped their past. The line between reality and illusion was blurring, and Julia could feel it happening to her too. She woke one morning to find herself standing outside the tent barefoot, her fingers digging into the cold dirt. She had no memory of how she got there, only a vague sense that something had drawn her out. Monroe's condition was deteriorating as well. He spent most of his time by the crevasse, staring down into the depths, muttering to himself about the energy that pulsed from the planet's core. Julia tried to pull him back, but he was obsessed, convinced that the answer to everything lay beneath the surface. "It's not just geological," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's its doorway. The energy here, it's as a bridge between worlds." Julia didn't want to believe him, but the more time she spent on Sisira, the more she felt it too. The planet wasn't just breaking apart physically. It was unraveling, something far deeper, something that was pulling them all into its web. Julia's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she stood at the edge of the crevasse, staring into the abyss. Monroe was down there somewhere. His descent had been slow, at first methodical, almost as if he'd been entranced by whatever was waiting at the bottom. She tried to stop him, to pull him back, but something stronger than fear had pulled him in. Now he was gone, his voice echoing faintly from the depths, growing fainter with each passing minute. She clenched her fists, cursing herself for letting it get this far. The mission was falling apart. Logan had vanished, likely claimed by the planet, size-shifting surface, and O'Neill's faction was getting restless. The hallucinations were becoming more vivid, more terrifying. People were losing their grip on reality, and Julia wasn't too far behind them. The whispers were constant. Now, even when she closed her eyes, they crept into her thoughts, twisting her memories, distorting her sense of time. She did catch glimpses of people she knew couldn't be here, old friends, dead comrades just out of sight. The planet was unraveling them one by one. "Captain O'Neill," Seth's voice snapped her back to reality. She turned to see the lieutenant standing a few feet away, her rifle slung over her shoulder, a grim look in her eye. We need to leave now. Monroe, Seth's gone. Logan, that's gone. Half the crew is barely hanging on to their sanity. We've got to pull out before this place takes the rest of us. Julia shook her head, her fingers tightening around the comm unit in her hand. Not yet. We need to find Monroe. He was onto something about the energy down there. If we leave now, we'll never know the truth about this place. The truth? O'Neill's voice cracked with disbelief. The truth is this planet is killing us. It's tearing us apart, and if we don't tag it out soon, it'll finish the job. Julia wanted to argue to tell her that they had a duty to complete the mission, but deep down, she knew O'Neill was right. The planet was breaking them physically, mentally, and every minute they stayed, they lost another piece of themselves. She lowered her gaze, the weight of the decision crushing her. Give me one more day if we can. Find Monroe by then. Only. O'Neill's expression hardened, but she nodded. One day, but after that, we were gone. Julia watched her walk away, her shoulders tense with barely contained frustration. She knew O'Neill was trying to hold the team together just as much as she was. But this wasn't true just about survival anymore. Something was pulling her deeper into Sochira's secrets, something she couldn't turn away from, no matter how much danger it posed. She looked down into the crevasse again, her heart racing. Monroe was down there, and if she didn't try go after him, she'd never know what had drawn him in. Without another thought, Julia fastened a harness around her waist, clipped it to the rappelling line, and began her descent. The deeper she went, the more the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, memories, emotions that weren't her own. Faces flashed in her mind. Logan sat as wide, terrified eyes. O'Neill, sold, determined gaze. Monroe, frantic muttering. But there were others, too. Faces she didn't recognize from a time long before her own. The weight of their presence pressed against her skull as though their spirits were trapped here, lingering in the cracks of this dying world. The air grew thick with heat as she descended further into the planet. The glowing crystals that lined the walls pulsed with an unnatural light, casting eerie shadows that twisted and shifted as if they were alive. She could feel the energy, now strong, overwhelming, almost suffocating. It was alive, like Monroe had said, and it wanted something from them. Finally, her boots hit solid ground at the bottom of the crevasse. The air was stifling here, thick with the scent of sulfur and burning rock. The walls, hummed with the energy pulsing through them like the very veins of the planet, were exposed. Ahead she saw Monroe, standing in front of a massive alien structure embedded in the rock. The architecture was strange, twisting geometric patterns that seemed to defy logic, glowing with a soft blue light that contrasted sharply with the fiery red of the planet's core. Monroe was transfixed, his hands outstretched toward the structure, his eyes wide and vacant. Monroe, Julia called out, but he didn't respond. His body was rigid, as though he were frozen in place by some invisible force. She ran to him, grabbing his arm, shaking him violently. Monroe snapped out of it. For a moment, his eyes flickered with recognition, but then they clouded over again. It's beautiful, isn't it? He murmured, his voice distant. The power, it's and beyond anything we've ever known. So alive. Julia gritted her teeth, pulling him back from the structure. This place is killing us. Monroe, we need to leave. No, he whispered, shaking his head. You don't understand this energy. It's not just the planet. It's a gateway, a way to transcend the aliens who built this. They were trying to harness it, but they failed. We can succeed where they did. Monroe, listen to yourself, Julia said, her voice trembling. This planet is collapsing. If we don't destroy whatever this is, it'll tear us apart. Monroe sass, face twisted with something like pity. You were afraid of it, just like they were. But I am not. I see it for what it is, an opportunity. Before Julia could react, Monroe turned and placed his hands on the glowing surface of the structure. The energy flared, and suddenly the entire crevasse was filled with light, so bright it burned Julia and Yuri. She stumbled back, shielding her face, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel her mind slipping, losing its grip on reality. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and cracks spider-webbed across the surface of the alien structure. The energy was out of control, tearing at the fabric of the planet itself. She had to stop it, but Monroe was too far gone. His body convulsed, his mouth open in a silent scream as the energy surged through him, consuming him. Julia knew she had only moments before the entire planet collapsed under the strain. She drew her sidearm, leveling it at the structure. The shot echoed through the crevasse, and the bullet struck the heart of the alien machine. There was a blinding flash, and the world went white. When Julia opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of the crevasse, her body aching, her head spinning. The light was gone, replaced by the dim red glow of the planet's core. The alien structure was silent now, its energy extinguished. Monroe was gone. His body had disintegrated, consumed by the power he had tried to control. The ground beneath her feet was still trembling, but the cracks had stopped spreading. The planet was still unstable, but the energy had been neutralized. The gateway had closed. She staggered to her feet, her legs weak, her mind foggy with exhaustion. She activated her comm unit. "O'Neill, this is Morgan. I am coming back." There was a brief pause, then O'Neill's voice crackled through the static. "You were alive?" "Barely," Julia muttered, making her way back to the surface. "Get the team ready. We relieve it." The shuttle rose into the sky, carrying the last of the surviving colonists away from the dying planet. Julia sat in the cockpit, staring down at the fractured surface of Sosira as it shrank beneath them. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a hollow silence that filled her with an aching sense of loss. They had lost so much on that planet. Good people, their sanity, their sense of reality. Monroe had been right about one thing: the energy on Sosira wasn't T-natural. It was something far more ancient and dangerous than they could have ever imagined. But in the end, it had been too much for them to handle. They weren't too ready for it. Maybe they never would be. As the shuttle broke through Sosira's atmosphere and into the cold expanse of space, Julia closed her eyes, letting the quiet wash over her. The mission had been a failure. The colony was gone, but they were alive. For now, that was enough.